long before the first pyramids rose above the sands of Egypt, long before the first kings carved their names into clay and stone, long before the flood stories that every ancient culture still carries in its memory. Someone was already here. They shaped the earth, measured the sky, and then they disappeared so completely that the civilizations who came after them remembered them only as gods. If this story is hitting you right, please like and subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss us. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read every single one. The Sumerians were not the first. This is what the Sumerians themselves believed. When their scribes pressed the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform into wet clay, they did not claim to be the origin of knowledge. They claimed to have received it. They wrote of teachers who came before them. They wrote of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the Great Flood. They wrote of beings they called the Anunnaki, the ones who came down, the ones from whom civilization itself was said to descend. And in every version of the story, there is the same quiet admission buried in the clay. There was something here before us. There was someone here before us. And whatever that was, it ended. For more than a century, the academic world has drawn a clean line between myth and history. On one side of that line are the things we can prove, the ruins we can date, the bones we can carbon test, the inscriptions we can translate. On the other side are the stories, the legends, the tablets that speak of gods and giants and floods. And for a long time, the second side was dismissed as imagination. But something has been happening in the last 50 years that is difficult to ignore. The ground itself has begun to speak, and the things the ground is saying are not matching the timeline we were given. What you are about to see is not a theory. It is not a conclusion. It is a collection of facts, inscriptions, and discoveries that have each been verified by the people trained to verify them. And when those pieces are placed next to each other, in the right order, a shape begins to appear. A shape that history books do not have a name for. A shape that the ancient texts did have a name for. A name they repeated again and again across thousands of years. A name they used when they wanted to describe the time before their own beginning. They called it the Boer. They called it the age before the flood. They called it the first world. And in the timeline of mainstream history, that world is not supposed to exist at all. This is the mystery of the 12,000 years of silence, the gap between the moment when everything should have been impossible and the moment when everything suddenly already was. The gap between a species that had just discovered how to plant seeds and a civilization that could already track the movement of stars across millennia. The gap that no textbook has ever explained. The gap that the ancients themselves filled with a single word, a word that comes down to us from the oldest surviving writing in the world, a word that appears in stone thousands of years before it appears in any modern dictionary. Anunnaki, the ones who came before. Tree enormous men enormous spur on their feet. Rants of the problem that professional archaeologists have been quietly uncomfortable with for almost 100 years. The birth of civilization, as we define it, is not gradual. It is sudden. It does not emerge gradually across the prehistoric landscape. It arrives fully formed, complete with writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, complex agriculture, monumental architecture, organized religion, codified law, and a fully developed bureaucracy. And the place where it arrives first, in the archaeological record, is Mesopotamia. Around 5,500 years ago, in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a place called Sumer. This is not a controversial claim. Every standard reference on the history of civilization will tell you the same thing. The Sumerians are the first. They invent writing. They invent the wheel. They invent the sexagesimal counting system that still governs how we measure time and degrees of a circle. They invent the first codes of law. They invent the first cities with populations in the tens of thousands. They invent temple complexes so massive that the foundations of some of them have still not been fully excavated. They do all of this, apparently, from nothing. 1,000 years earlier, the land that would become Sumer is populated by small villages of farmers who use simple stone tools. And then, in a stretch of time that is short by any historical measure, those farmers become the first true city dwellers on Earth. Historians have a polite word for this. They call it the Sumerian takeoff. When pressed on what caused it, they tend to speak of gradual development, of trade networks, of the slow accumulation of knowledge over generations. And some of that is undoubtedly true. Knowledge does build on knowledge. Techniques are refined. Populations grow. But there is a difference between gradual refinement and the instantaneous possession of an entire cognitive toolkit. The Sumerians did not slowly work their way toward a base 60 number system over the course of centuries. It appears in their earliest tablets already in use. They did not experiment their way toward a zodiac of 12 constellations divided across a 360-degree sky. That zodiac is already in place in their earliest astronomical records. They did not stumble into the knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, the slow 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis. That knowledge is embedded in their mythological cycles before any Greek astronomer was born to rediscover it. There is a further layer to this problem that is rarely discussed in popular accounts. When we speak of the Sumerians inventing writing, we tend to imagine a gradual progression from simple pictographs into more abstract symbols, and to a point that progression does appear in the archaeological record. But the earliest full Sumerian documents are not rough pictographs. They are administrative records of extraordinary sophistication. They track inventories of goods across multiple temples and cities. They record ratios, accounts, allocations, and contracts. They do all of this in a system capable of expressing complex ideas with remarkable precision. To use a writing system at that level, the system has to have been developed, stabilized, and taught to a class of trained scribes. None of that happens overnight. And yet the evidence for the development phase, the long, messy period of experimentation that should precede any functioning writing system, is surprisingly thin. What we have, mostly, is the finished product. The same is true of their legal system. The famous Code of Hammurabi, compiled in Babylon, is usually cited as one of the oldest codes of law. But Hammurabi is not the originator. He is a late compiler, drawing on Sumerian legal precedents that had been in place for 1,000 years before him. The Sumerian legal codes, when they first appear in the written record, already assume the existence of courts, of witnesses, of property ownership, of complex contracts for the leasing of fields and the lending of silver. They assume a society that knows how to resolve disputes through an established procedure. They do not describe the invention of such a society. They describe its maintenance. In the same way, the Sumerian religious calendar is already, on its first appearance in the record, a system. Festivals tied to specific days of specific lunar months, offerings of prescribed items at prescribed times. A priesthood organized into ranks with specific duties, temples dedicated to specific deities whose personalities, stories, and relationships to each other are already fixed. The religion, like the writing and the law, does not appear in the process of being assembled. It appears already assembled, and the most natural way for this to happen, in the absence of a long gradual development, is for the system to have been imported, intact, from somewhere else. The Sumerians themselves gave an answer to where it came from. Their answer has been known for more than 100 years. It is written, in their own words, on tablets that can be visited in museums today. Their answer is that none of this was invented by them. Their answer is that all of it was given to them, by teachers, by beings who arrived in the distant past, before the flood, and who civilized humanity from a starting point of complete ignorance. Those teachers, in the Sumerian account, are the Anunnaki, and according to the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest documents in human history, those teachers established kingship on Earth long before the flood swept everything away. The king list survives in several versions. The most complete is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, a small four-sided clay object held today at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The prism lists the rulers of Mesopotamia going backward in time. The later kings are historical. Their reigns are measured in decades. Their names are verified by independent inscriptions. Going further back, the reigns begin to lengthen. And then, at a certain point, the list crosses a threshold. It reaches what it calls the time before the flood. And the reigns of the kings listed before the flood are not measured in decades. They are measured in thousands of years. 8 kings, in the most common version of the list, 241,200 years of combined rule, ruling over a world that, according to every standard history book, did not exist. It is easy to dismiss this as pure imagination. scribes exaggerating, priests inventing a deeper past to give legitimacy to the present. And for most of the 20th century, that was the accepted explanation. The king list was myth. The pre-flood kings were poetry. The Anunnaki were theology. None of it had any bearing on actual history, except that the king list itself does not treat the pre-flood kings differently from the historical ones. It lists them in the same format, in the same document, with the same seriousness. The scribes who compiled it clearly believed they were recording a continuous history, not a mythology grafted onto a fact. And the number they arrived at for the time before the flood, when measured against what we have since learned about the actual end of the last ice age, is uncomfortably suggestive. The last ice age ended, according to geologists and climatologists, roughly 12,000 years ago, not in a slow thaw, in a sudden, catastrophic shift. A global event so severe that it left its signature in ice cores in Greenland, in sediment layers on every continent, and in the oral traditions of almost every ancient culture that survived it. That event has a name. It is called the Younger Dryas termination, and the date of its ending lines up, almost exactly, with the moment when the Sumerian king list says the pre-flood world was destroyed. A coincidence, perhaps. A convergence of two independent records pointing at the same moment in the past. Or perhaps something else. Tree B. Kaif. The 12,000-year gap. To understand what is strange about this timeline, it helps to look at where the archaeological record picks back up after the Ice Age ends. The oldest undisputed writing is Sumerian, dated to around 3200 BC. The oldest unquestioned large-scale civilization is Sumerian, dated to around the same period. But the earliest known monumental architecture is not Sumerian. It is not even close to Sumerian. It is found in modern-day southeastern Turkey, in a hilltop site that no one even knew existed until the late 20th century. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and its date is close to 12,000 years old. Göbekli Tepe should not exist. That is the blunt way to state the problem. Everything we were taught about how civilization develops is contradicted by the stones at Göbekli Tepe. We were taught that complex societies are built on agriculture. First, humans learn to farm. Then they settle into villages. Then the surplus food allows specialization. Then specialization allows the development of religion, art, architecture, and government. This sequence, we were told, takes thousands of years. It is gradual. It is linear. And without agriculture, none of it can begin. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who had not yet begun to farm. The archaeological evidence is consistent on this point. The site is surrounded by the bones of wild animals, hunted with stone tools. There is no evidence of domesticated grain, no evidence of stored harvests, no evidence of the sedentary lifestyle that agriculture requires. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, in the strictest academic sense, and yet they quarried limestone pillars weighing up to 16 tons. They shaped those pillars into precise T-shapes. They carved them with reliefs of foxes, lions, scorpions, birds, boars, and figures that are clearly meant to represent human or near-human beings. They arranged them in carefully planned circular enclosures, aligned with what appears to be astronomical precision. They raised a sanctuary of stone at the top of a hill at a time when the rest of the world was still chasing game with sharpened flint. This is not a case of a few crude standing stones. Göbekli Tepe, as the excavations have progressed, has turned out to be enormous. Geophysical surveys suggest at least 20 major enclosures beneath the surface, most of them still unexcavated. The workmanship on the visible pillars is sophisticated. The planning required to construct the site suggests not only organized labor, but a long prior tradition of building. You do not simply decide one morning to quarry 16-ton limestone slabs from a distant ridge, transport them miles across uneven terrain, and raise them into astronomically aligned circles. That kind of project requires engineering knowledge, social organization, and accumulated expertise, all of which were supposed to be impossible at that date. All of which were supposed to come thousands of years later, in Sumer. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In the last 15 years, a string of related sites have been identified across the same region of southeastern Turkey. The whole complex has been given a name. It is called Taş Tepeler, which in Turkish means stone hills. More than a dozen sites with similar architecture and similar dating have now been confirmed. Each of them features the same distinctive T-shaped pillars. Each of them features carved animal reliefs. Each of them appears to have been built by people who, according to every orthodox chronology, should not have been able to build such things at all. One of these sites, Karahan Tepe, has been excavated more recently and has produced results that are, if anything, more startling than Göbekli Tepe itself. At Karahan Tepe, archaeologists have uncovered a chamber carved directly into bedrock, featuring a row of stone pillars rising from the floor and a single carved human head emerging from the wall. Watching the chamber with an unsettling patience, the chamber is arranged with a precision that suggests a deliberate ritual purpose. The carving of the head is unmistakably human and unmistakably old. Its date, like Göbekli Tepe, falls in the 11th or 12th millennium before the Common Era. Another of the Taş Tepeler sites, Nivali Sori, was excavated before it was flooded by the construction of the Ataturk Dam. Nivali Sori produced limestone sculptures of human figures with unusual hairstyles, carrying what may have been serpents, dating to roughly 10,000 years ago. The sculptures are not crude. They are carved with a confidence and a proportional sense that is unexpected in a pre-pottery, pre-agricultural context. The site also produced what appears to have been a communal ceremonial building, with stone pillars set into its walls. Nivali Sori sits underwater now, beneath the reservoir. Its stones are lost to us, except for the fragments that were recovered before the flooding. Whatever secrets the rest of the site might have yielded, they will not be yielded, at least not in our time. The point of noting all of this is that Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated oddity. It is one node in a regional network of contemporaneous sites, built by people who clearly shared a culture, a cosmology, and a set of architectural conventions. These people, whoever they were not fumbling their way towards something. They were already in possession of something. They had a tradition. They had techniques. Had techniques, they had a worldview sophisticated enough to carve into stone, and they did all of this, according to the Orthodox timeline, before they had domesticated a single crop. Before they had a city. Before they had, by any standard definition, begun the work of civilization. So the question that Göbekli Tepe forces upon us is not whether the site exists. It clearly does. The question is where the knowledge came from. Who were the people who showed up in the foothills of Turkey 12,000 years ago with the ability to do something that no other culture on Earth, at that time, is supposed to have been able to do? And when Göbekli Tepe was abandoned, around 10,000 years ago, those same people did something stranger still. They did not simply walk away from the site. They buried it. Deliberately. They filled every enclosure with earth and rubble, covered it over and left it sealed beneath the hill. Whatever they were, they did not want Göbekli Tepe to be found again. The 12,000 years of silence, then, is not an empty gap. It is the space between a sudden, inexplicable appearance of sophisticated stonework at Göbekli Tepe and the equally sudden, equally inexplicable appearance of fully formed civilization in Sumer. Between those two events, the archaeological record shows a world that is mostly primitive, small villages, simple tools, gradual, slow development. But bracketing that gradual development, on either side, are these two anomalies. 2 points of light in a mostly dark map. 2 moments where the prehistoric story refuses to fit the simple narrative of linear progress. And the traditions of the Sumerians themselves, when read in this light, stop sounding like mythology and start sounding like memory. They remembered teachers. They remembered a world before their own world. They remembered a catastrophe that ended that world, and they remembered, most importantly, that the knowledge they possessed was not theirs to begin with. It had been inherited, salvaged, carried forward by survivors. What the land remembers. The history of the ground itself agrees, in broad strokes, with the history the Sumerians wrote down. The period between roughly 12,800 and 11,700 years ago was one of the most violent climate intervals in human prehistory. It is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas. The name comes from a small Arctic flower whose pollen suddenly appears, in that period, far south of where it had any business being. The flower is a marker, It tells scientists that something happened to the climate that caused a dramatic, nearly instantaneous return to Ice Age conditions after a brief warming period. The world, which had been slowly emerging from the last glacial maximum, was plunged back into cold for more than 1,000 years, and then, at the end of that plunge, it warmed again, suddenly, and the Ice Age ended for good. The mechanism of the Younger Dryas has been debated for decades. One leading hypothesis, supported by an accumulating body of evidence, is that it was triggered by a catastrophic event, possibly a cometary impact, possibly the fragmentation of a large object in the upper atmosphere, raining debris across the northern hemisphere. In sediment layers from across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, researchers have identified a thin layer of material dated to roughly 12,800 years ago that contains unusual concentrations of nanodiamonds, melt glass, and platinum group elements. These materials are associated with high-energy impact events. The layer has been given a name. It is called the Younger Dryas boundary, and beneath it, in many locations, the remains of a previous ecosystem are found. Above it, an ecosystem in collapse. Whatever triggered the Younger Dryas, its effects were staggering. Sea levels, which had been rising, paused and then lurched upward. Ice sheets that had been retreating broke apart. Vast floods, triggered by collapsing ice dams, poured across continents. Entire species of megafauna went extinct in a blink of geological time. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, all of them disappeared from the fossil record in the same narrow window. And human populations, which had been expanding into those environments, contracted. Settlements were abandoned. Tool traditions that had persisted for thousands of years vanished. Whatever civilization, if any, had been present before the event would have had a hard time surviving it. The specific evidence for the impact scenario deserves a closer look, because it is often misrepresented as either conclusive proof or total speculation. The truth is more interesting than either framing. At dozens of sites across North America, at a handful of sites in Europe, and at a growing number of sites in the Middle East and South America, researchers have found a consistent layer of unusual material at the precise stratigraphic level corresponding to 12,800 years ago. That material contains tiny spherules of melted rock, nanoscale diamonds of the sort that form only under enormous pressure and heat, elevated concentrations of platinum and iridium that are characteristic of extraterrestrial sources, and microscopic carbon particles consistent with widespread burning. The layer is thin, but it is remarkably consistent. It has been confirmed by multiple independent research teams. It has been published in peer-reviewed geological journals. Its interpretation is debated, but its existence is not. Something happened at that moment, something that left a geological signature visible across large portions of the northern hemisphere. Human settlements of that period also show a distinct disruption. The Clovis culture of North America, which had spread widely during the late Pleistocene, effectively disappears from the archaeological record at the same stratigraphic horizon where the impact material is found. Villages along river valleys in the Middle East show signs of sudden abandonment, with the living surfaces of their houses preserved in a thin layer of charred debris. In the cave sequences of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Tufian culture, which had been developing what looked like the beginnings of sedentary village life, undergoes a sharp contraction, returning for several centuries to more nomadic patterns. These are not the signs of a slow climate change. They are the signs of a shock, and this is what is strange about the archaeological record in the millennia that follow. The sophistication of the toolkits drops. The populations fragment, but certain pieces of knowledge appear to survive, carried by survivors into the new world that emerged when the ice finally released its grip. Those survivors, if they existed, would have been the source of the knowledge that the later civilizations of the Near East would credit to beings from the sky. They would have been the ancestors of the memory that became the Anunnaki, and their world. The world that ended when the Younger Dryas ended would have been the world that the Sumerian king list remembered as the age before the flood. This is where the question turns, for many researchers, from an academic puzzle into something far more unsettling. Because if there was a civilization, even a small and localized one, that survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe, it would have possessed knowledge that its hunter-gatherer neighbors did not. It would have looked, to those neighbors, like something superhuman. Its members would have carried the memories of a world that no one else alive could remember. They would have taught what they knew. They would have been remembered in the stories of the people they taught as teachers from before. Teachers from the age before the waters came, teachers whose own origin, seen from the outside, would have been indistinguishable from the divine. The Topples, then the Kens before the flood. The Sumerian king list is not the only ancient record to describe a world before our own. It may be the most famous, but it is not unique. Across the ancient world, from the river valleys of the Nile to the highlands of Persia to the temple complexes of India, the same pattern repeats. There was a first time, a golden age, an era when gods or godlike beings walked the earth and ruled it. That age ended in catastrophe, usually by water. A remnant survived. The world we live in now is the second world, built by the survivors on the memory of what was lost. The Egyptian version of this belief is called Zep-Tepi. The phrase translates roughly as the first time. According to the temple traditions preserved in places like Edfu and Heliopolis, Zep-Tepi was the age when the gods ruled Egypt in person. They established the sacred geometry of the Nile Valley. They laid down the laws. They built the original temples, of which the later stone monuments were merely reconstructions. The reigns of these divine rulers were measured, again, not in years, but in thousands of years. When the Egyptian priest Manetho compiled the history of his country in the 3rd century BC, he included the reigns of the gods as a matter of historical record, not metaphor. His king list begins with the god Ptah, who according to Manetho ruled for 9,000 years. It proceeds through a series of divine rulers whose total reigns span tens of thousands of years. Only after those reigns are concluded does the list arrive at the first human pharaoh. The Turin Royal Canon, a fragmentary papyrus dating to the 13th century BC, preserves a similar sequence. It, too, lists a long dynasty of divine rulers before the first mortal king of Egypt. The dates it gives for those divine rulers are measured in thousands of years. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to determine whether these numbers reflect actual historical belief, astronomical cycles, or symbolic mathematics. But the consistency is striking. An Egyptian scribe in the 13th century BC, writing down the king list of his country, did not begin with the first mortal pharaoh. He began with beings he called gods, reigning for ages before the first man wore the crown. Same pattern appears in a different key in the Hebrew Bible. The early chapters of Genesis describe a line of patriarchs, beginning with Adam, whose lifespans are measured in centuries. Methuselah, the longest lived, is said to have reached 969 years. The lifespans shorten after the flood, quickly converging on a human range. The Hebrew tradition, like the Sumerian and the Egyptian, remembers a previous age in which time ran differently. It remembers a catastrophe, a flood, that reset the world. And it remembers that after the flood, things were not the same as before. In Mesopotamia, the flood tradition is even more detailed. The Epoch of Gilgamesh, written down in multiple versions across the 2nd millennium BC, contains a flood story that is recognizable to anyone who has read the book of Genesis. A single righteous man, a warning from a sympathetic God, a great boat built to specific dimensions, a gathering of animals, a flood that wipes out the world. A dove, then a raven, sent out to see if the waters have receded. A landing on a mountaintop. A sacrifice. A covenant. The parallels are so close that the earliest scholars who translated the Gilgamesh tablets in the 19th century could barely contain their surprise. The flood story, they realized, was older than the Bible. And the Bible was not the origin of it. The Bible was inheriting it from an earlier tradition. That was itself inheriting it from an earlier tradition still. The Atrahasis epic, another Mesopotamian text, expands the flood story and places it in the context of the Anunnaki. In Atrahasis, the flood is not an act of spontaneous divine anger. It is a decision made by the council of the gods after they have decided that humanity, which they themselves created, has become too numerous. The gods plan to destroy their own creation. One of them, the god Enki, warns a single man. He gives the man precise instructions. Build a boat. Make it watertight. Gather the seed of every living thing. The rest of humanity is allowed to drown. And when the waters recede, the survivor steps out onto dry land, and civilization begins again. If you strip away the theology from the Atrahasis story and listen only to the shape of the narrative, something interesting emerges. A small group with superior knowledge anticipates a coming catastrophe. They select a survivor. They give that survivor the technical specifications needed to live through the event. After the event, the survivor becomes the seed of a new civilization. This is not an uncommon shape for a memory to take. It is the shape of a story passed down by people who actually lived through a disaster. It is the shape of a memory that has been simplified, dramatized, and carried across thousands of years until the original event has become indistinguishable from mythology. And whether or not we accept the theological framing, the underlying structure is consistent with the geological record. Something did happen 12,000 years ago. Something catastrophic. Something that left traces in the ground and in the stories. The Sumerian tradition names the beings who acted in that story. They called them the Anunnaki. The word itself is built from two pieces. Anu, meaning sky or heaven, and Ki, meaning earth. The Anunnaki, in the literal translation of their own name, are the ones who came from the sky to the earth. They are the mediators between the two worlds. And according to the tablets, they did more than just issue warnings and destroy worlds. They taught. Before the flood, they established kingship. They gave humanity the arts of civilization. They set in motion a social order that the later kings of Sumer would claim to inherit. Every Sumerian king, in his royal inscriptions, would assert that his authority was not his own. It came from the Anunnaki. It was a borrowed light, passed from the age before the flood into the age after. The names of the pre-flood kings, as preserved in the Sumerian king list, are themselves strange. The first, Alulim, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years from the city of Eridu. The second, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years from the same city. The third, Anmen-Luana, ruled for 30,200 years from Bad Tibera. The numbers are extraordinary on their face, but look closer at them, and a pattern emerges. They are almost all multiples of 3600, the base unit of the Sumerian sexagesimal system, which they called a sar. Reading the numbers in sars rather than in years gives a more modest but still striking total. 8 kings, 67 sars, or, if you prefer, a span of time that is unitless, symbolic, sacred, measured in the ritual mathematics of the Sumerian world. What the scribes of Sumer were doing when they wrote these numbers down is impossible to know for certain. They may have been recording real chronologies in a coded form. They may have been preserving astronomical cycles. They may have been writing theology in the language of arithmetic. But what is certain is that they did not treat the pre-flood kings as imaginary. They treated them as part of a continuous history. They placed them before the historical kings, in the same document, in the same format. They believed, or at least asserted, that there had been a world before the flood, that it had been ruled by kings of extraordinary lifespan, and that the knowledge that underpinned their own civilization came down to them from that vanished world. And in a different location, thousands of miles away, in a different language, the Egyptian priests were saying, in slightly different words, the same thing. There is another ancient source worth mentioning here, because it bridges the Mesopotamian and Greek worlds, and because it preserves a record that is often overlooked in modern discussions. His name was Berossus. He was a Babylonian priest of the god Marduk, living in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and he wrote a history of his own country for a Greek-speaking audience. Only fragments of his work survive, quoted by later writers like Eusebius and Josephus. But those fragments are remarkable. Berossus wrote of a series of teachers who came out of the sea at the beginning of civilization and instructed humanity in the arts of writing, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, and law. The first and greatest of these teachers was a being he called Oannes, described as having the body of a fish and the features of a man, who emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf each day to teach the earliest Babylonians and returned to the sea at night. After Oannes, there were others. Berossus named 6 of them. Their total period of teaching spans thousands of years before the Great Flood. And the mythology they taught, Berossus is careful to note, was the theology that the Babylonians of his own time still held. It was not remote. It was not forgotten. It was still, in his day, the foundation of how Babylonian civilization understood itself. the description of Oans is strange enough to deserve a second look. A being who comes from the water. A being who appears man-like but is not simply a man. A being who is understood to have brought civilization from outside, from elsewhere, from somewhere that is not the dry land where the students sat. In the symbolism of the ancient world, the sea is often a boundary, a zone of the unknown, a place that separates the knowable from the unknowable. A teacher who comes out of the sea is, by the logic of that symbolism, a teacher who comes from beyond. Berossus does not tell us what to make of this. He simply records it as the belief of his ancestors. And his ancestors, the Babylonians, were themselves inheritors of Sumerian tradition. The figure of Oans is likely a late echo of the earlier Sumerian idea of the Anunnaki teachers. Stripped of its theological ornaments, it is another version of the same core memory. Someone came. They taught us. They left. We remember. The pattern continues east, in the sacred literature of ancient India, preserved across thousands of years of oral and written tradition. There is a cosmological framework known as the Yuga system. According to this framework, time is not linear but cyclical, moving through ages of varying length and character. Each great cycle, or Mahayuga, consists of 4 ages. The Satya Yuga, or Age of Truth, is the longest and the most spiritually elevated. It is followed by the Treta Yuga, then the Dvapara Yuga, and finally the Kali Yuga, which is the shortest, the most materially oriented, and the most morally degraded. According to the Hindu reckoning, we are currently living in the Kali Yuga, which began thousands of years ago. But before us, in the earlier yugas, there were beings who possessed powers and knowledge beyond our own. There were sages, rishis, who could do things that modern humans cannot do. There were cities, mentioned in the Puranas and the Mahabharata, that had technologies unrecognizable to us today. And there were catastrophes, great floods, cosmic fires, long periods of darkness. The Mahayuga in the Hindu view is a wheel, turning over and over, and each turn brings forth a new world from the wreckage of the last. What is striking about the Hindu Yuga system is its scale. The lengths of the yugas are measured in tens and hundreds of thousands of years. The full Mahayuga is said to span more than 4 million years. Whether these numbers are meant to be literal, symbolic, or astronomical is a matter that Hindu philosophers themselves have debated for centuries. But the underlying conviction is that the current state of humanity is not the only state, that we are not the first, that we are the latest in a very long series, and that the knowledge we possess now is a fraction, and possibly a degraded fraction, of what was once known. The same pattern appears, independently, in the traditions of Mesoamerica. The Aztec and Maya cosmologies both describe a series of prior worlds, or ages, each ruled by a different sun, each ending in a catastrophe. The Aztec version, preserved in sources like the Leyenda de los Sole and the Codex Chimalpopoca, speaks of 4 previous suns before our own. The first was destroyed by jaguars, the second by hurricanes, the third by a rain of fire, the fourth by a great flood. We are living in the age of the 5th sun, which will end, according to the tradition, in earthquake. The Maya long count calendar, which was in use across Mesoamerica for more than 2,000 years, tracked immense spans of time and anchored the current age to a starting date in the distant past. The scale of the long count, measuring in units of 400 years each, is designed for the recording of periods that dwarf ordinary human memory. It is not accidental that cultures on opposite sides of the planet, with no demonstrated contact during the periods when their cosmologies were formed, arrived at similar frameworks. A series of prior ages, a succession of catastrophes, a current age understood as late in a longer sequence. This is the shape of the ancient imagination when it looks backward. It does not look back at a flat, uniform prehistory. It looks back at a vast and tiered landscape, full of previous worlds that ended, and survivors who passed on what they could. This is not what we would expect to find if the ancient imagination were simply inventing stories. It is what we would expect to find if the ancient imagination were preserving, in degraded form, the distant echoes of actual events. Back in the Hebrew tradition, there is one further detail that deserves mention. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, just before the flood narrative begins, There is a passage that is notoriously difficult to interpret. It describes a class of beings called the Nephilim, often translated as giants or fallen ones, who came into the world when the sons of God took daughters of men to be their wives. These Nephilim, the text says, were the mighty men of old, men of renown. The passage is brief. It is mysterious. Most traditional commentators have treated it as either mythological or metaphorical. But its placement, right before the flood, is significant. The Genesis account, like the Sumerian account, imagines a pre-flood world populated by beings who are not quite human, who were remembered as heroes and who were swept away when the waters came. The survivors of the flood, in the Hebrew telling, are Noah and his family. The survivors of the flood, in the Sumerian telling, are the family of Zusudra, or in the later Akkadian version, Utnapishtim. The survivors in every telling are asked to carry forward what was left of the world that ended, and every telling remembers that what they carried was, in some essential sense, not their own. Toph. Part 2. Theories and what they can and not explain. When a consistent story appears across multiple, unrelated ancient cultures, it demands an explanation. The traditional academic response has been to treat the repetition as coincidence, or as the natural product of the human mind inventing similar stories in similar circumstances. Floods happen. Rivers overflow. Kings want legitimacy. Priests want mystery. The convergence of flood myths, pre-flood kings, and teaching gods across the ancient world can be, and has been, explained as the ordinary outcome of independent imaginations working on similar raw material. And to some extent, this is a reasonable position. Myths do share themes across cultures. Archetypes do recur. The flood story is certainly shaped, in part, by the experience of living in river valleys that occasionally flood. The divine king is certainly shaped, in part, by the political need to justify a throne, but there is a point at which the convergence becomes difficult to explain by ordinary means alone. The specificity of some of the parallels is striking. The flood stories across cultures do not just share the theme of a flood. Many of them share particular details. A single warning, a single survivor, a boat built to specification, animals preserved, a mountaintop landing, the sending of birds to test the waters, the Zechariah after landfall. Those details are not the inevitable product of a generic flood experience. And when the common source is sought, the trail leads backward, through time and through culture, to the oldest written versions of the story, which are Sumerian. And before Sumerian, the trail goes cold. Because there's no older written tradition to consult, one interpretation of this, perhaps the most conservative, is that the story originated in Mesopotamia and spread, through trade and conquest and migration, across the ancient world. This explains the parallels without requiring any actual pre-flood civilization. The story was invented, or based on a localized flood event, in Sumer or its predecessors, and it was transmitted culturally to neighboring peoples, who then transmitted it to their neighbors, and so on. By the time it reached Egypt, India, and eventually Greece and the Hebrews, it had been carried on the currents of cultural exchange for thousands of years. This interpretation has a certain tidiness to it, but it struggles with cases where the same story appears in cultures that, as far as we know, had no contact with Mesopotamia. The flood traditions of the Maori. The flood traditions of certain Native American peoples. The flood traditions of the highlands of China. These are not places that can be easily linked to Sumerian cultural influence, and yet the stories are recognizable. Not identical, but recognizable. A great deluge. A few survivors. A new world built on the bones of the old. Something in the human imagination, or in the human memory, keeps returning to the same shape. A second interpretation, less conservative, suggests that the parallel memories point to a parallel experience, that there was in fact a catastrophic flood event in the distant past, witnessed by scattered populations across multiple continents, and that the stories preserved by those populations are the long, degraded echoes of real events. This interpretation has been given a name by some researchers. It is called the lost civilization hypothesis, and it suggests that what we are calling prehistory was not, in fact, empty, that there were sophisticated human societies that existed before the end of the last ice age, that those societies were destroyed in the catastrophe that ended the Younger Dryas. and that the survivors of those societies carried fragments of knowledge into the New World, where they were remembered as teachers, as culture bringers, and eventually as gods. The most prominent modern advocate of this interpretation is the author Graham Hancock, who has argued for it across a series of books and, more recently, a widely watched Netflix documentary series. Hancock's position is that mainstream archaeology has systematically underestimated the age of certain monumental sites, that the dating of civilization itself needs to be pushed back by thousands of years, and that the mythological record should be read not as pure fiction, but as coded memory. His work is controversial. He is a journalist rather than a credentialed archaeologist. Professional archaeologists have disputed many of his specific claims, but the broader question he has raised, whether there might have been a sophisticated culture or cultures that predated the recognized civilizations of the Bronze Age, is a question that Göbekli Tepe alone has made difficult to dismiss. A third interpretation, even further from the mainstream, is associated with the work of Zecharia Sitchin. In a series of books beginning in the 1970s, Sitchin argued that the Sumerian texts should be read literally. That the Anunnaki were not metaphors or cultural memories of a lost civilization. They were, according to Sitchin, actual beings from an actual planet. A planet he called Nibiru, which he claimed the Sumerians described as traveling in a long elliptical orbit and visiting the inner solar system once every 3,600 years. Sitchin's interpretation has been almost universally rejected by mainstream scholars of Sumerian. The linguists who work with the original texts have pointed out that his translations are often inaccurate, that key words he renders as referring to space travel do not actually carry those meanings, and that his conclusions go far beyond what the tablets themselves say. And yet his books have sold tens of millions of copies. His framework has shaped a generation of alternative historical thinking. It has given rise to an entire subgenre of ancient astronaut theory, which continues to shape how many people imagine the distant past. It would be too easy and perhaps intellectually dishonest to simply dismiss Sitchin and move on. His readings of the tablets are, at many points, indefensible. But the fact that so many people found his books compelling tells us something important. It tells us that when the mainstream story of human origins does not account for the scale of the anomalies, the human mind reaches for alternative stories. Sitchin's readers were not, for the most part, conspiracy theorists or the credulous. They were people who had noticed that there was something missing from the official narrative. People who had looked at the Sumerian tablets, at Göbekli Tepe, at the pyramids, at Puma Punku, and concluded that the textbook story was incomplete. Sitchin gave them a story that was complete, even if it was wrong. And the appetite for that story is itself evidence that the official story is not, at present, sufficient. A fourth interpretation, perhaps the most cautious, is that we simply do not yet know, that the archaeological record is incomplete, that many sites have not been excavated, that many tablets have not been translated, that the gap between Göbekli Tepe and Sumer, 12,000 years wide, is enormous in human terms, and that we have sampled almost none of it. Civilizations could have risen and fallen in that gap without leaving traces that we have yet found. Sea levels rose, in the period after the Younger Dryas, by more than 300 feet. Any coastal settlement from that period is now deep underwater. Forests grew over abandoned sites. Desertification swallowed others. We know what we know, in archaeology, from the thin strip of surviving evidence. The rest of the past is silent, and has been silent for a long time, and we should be careful not to mistake silence for absence. The scale of what is underwater deserves to be stated clearly, because it is rarely emphasized in popular histories of civilization. At the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, the coastlines of the world were radically different from what they are today. Vast areas of continental shelf that now lie beneath the sea were dry land. The Persian Gulf, a shallow basin, was a lush river valley fed by the Tigris and the Euphrates flowing down from their sources. The English Channel did not exist. Britain and Ireland were connected to the European mainland by a plain, now called Doggerland, that was home to populations of hunter-gatherers until the rising seas swallowed it. The Bering Strait was a land bridge, walked by generations of humans and animals moving between Asia and the Americas. Japan was connected to the continent. The Indonesian archipelago was largely fused into a single landmass, which modern researchers have named Sundaland, extending from the Malay Peninsula down through what is now a scattered chain of islands. Sundaland, at the height of the Ice Age, was an area of dry land roughly the size of the Indian subcontinent. And when the Ice Age ended, it went underwater. Almost all of it. Over the course of several thousand years, the rising seas drowned a region larger than many recognized ancient civilizations. What was on Sundaland is largely unknown. It has barely been investigated. The water depth, the silt, the coral growth, the difficulty of underwater archaeology, all of these have kept the region from being studied in the way that the dry continents have been studied. But it sits in a part of the world where human habitation is documented to go back 50,000 years or more. It was warm. It was well watered. It had abundant food resources. If there was anywhere on Earth where a sophisticated culture might have developed during the Ice Age, Sundaland is as plausible a candidate as any. And if such a culture existed, the rising seas would have destroyed it. The survivors, if there were any, would have fled inland, carrying their memory with them. They would have scattered across the archipelago, across mainland Southeast Asia, and, if the trade networks of the ancient world were as extensive as some researchers now believe, possibly much farther. The anomalies that keep returning Göbekli Tepe, as strange as it is not the only site that has raised the question of what was possible in the distant past. Other discoveries in other parts of the world have raised similar questions. They do not individually prove the existence of a lost civilization, but they accumulate, and the accumulation itself is significant. In the highlands of Bolivia, near Lake Titicaca, there is a site called Pumapunku. It is part of a larger complex known as Tiwanaku. The conventional dating of Tiwanaku places it in the 1st millennium AD, which by archaeological standards is relatively recent. But the stonework at Pumapunku is not conventional. The site contains blocks of hard andesite and diorite that have been shaped with extraordinary precision, interlocking joints, cut to fractions of a millimeter, holes drilled into stone surfaces with a consistency that would be difficult to achieve, even with modern tools. H-shaped blocks, precisely mirrored, fitting together in a way that suggests deliberate design. The craftsmanship is so unusual that researchers have offered a wide range of explanations for how it was done. From the use of soft copper tools to the theoretical use of volcanic glass abrasives, no fully satisfactory explanation has been arrived at. The stones are simply there, in the thin air of the Altiplano, and they appear to have been made by people with a level of stoneworking skill that does not fit easily into the accepted timeline. Off the coast of the Japanese island of Yonaguni, at a depth of about 80 feet, divers in the 1980s discovered a formation of stone that some have argued is the remains of a submerged building or city. The Yonaguni Monument, as it is called, features terraces, right angles, flat faces, and what appear to be steps and platforms. It is a controversial site. Geologists have argued with substantial evidence that the formations are natural, produced by the characteristic fracture patterns of the local sandstone. But other researchers have pointed out features that are difficult to explain as purely natural, including apparent carvings and tool marks. If Yonaguni is artificial, its age is significant. The site would have been above water only before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. It would have been submerged at roughly the same time as the Younger Dryas catastrophe, which places it, if it is real, in exactly the period when the Sumerian tradition says the pre-flood world ended. In the Black Sea, a different kind of flooding story has been explored by a pair of marine geologists named William Ryan and Walter Pittman. Their research, published in the 1990s, argued that the Black Sea, which is currently a large inland sea, was once a freshwater lake, separated from the Mediterranean by a natural barrier at what is now the Bosporus Strait. According to Ryan and Pittman, that barrier broke through catastrophically about 7,500 years ago. Mediterranean seawater poured into the Black Sea basin in a flood of unimaginable scale. The lake's coastline, which would have been populated by early agricultural societies, was submerged within months. Entire settlements, entire cultures went underwater. The event, if it happened as they describe, would have been a plausible candidate for the origin of the flood traditions that later spread throughout the region. The Ryan-Pittman hypothesis remains debated, but submerged shorelines, ruined structures, and remains of early settlements have in fact been documented beneath the modern Black Sea at depths consistent with their proposed timeline. Something was down there. Something that used to be above water. At Giza, the controversy takes a different form. The Great Sphinx has long been dated by conventional Egyptology to the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BC. But a geological argument, advanced initially by the researcher Robert Schoch, has challenged that dating. Schoch pointed to weathering patterns on the enclosure walls around the Sphinx. The grooves and channels in the limestone, he argued, are consistent with prolonged water erosion rather than wind erosion. The Giza Plateau for thousands of years has been a dry desert. For the Sphinx enclosure to have been eroded by water on the scale that Schoch observed, the weathering would have had to occur in a period when the climate of North Africa was significantly wetter. That period, he pointed out, was the Green Sahara, which ended several thousand years before the reign of Khafre. Schoch's conclusion, controversial and disputed by most Egyptologists, is that the Sphinx is much older than conventionally accepted. It may have been carved, or at least begun, in an earlier era, possibly as early as 9 or 10,000 years ago. On the island of Java in Indonesia, there's a hill called Gunung Padang that has, in recent years, become the subject of an extraordinary archaeological controversy. The surface of the hill features a megalithic arrangement of columnar basalt stones that local tradition has long treated as a sacred site. Under the direction of the geologist Danny Hillman Natawijaja, a series of deep surveys and limited excavations were undertaken at the site during the last decade. The results, if they hold up under further scrutiny, are astonishing. The hill, according to the research team, is not a natural hill at all. It is a terraced, layered pyramidal structure with multiple construction phases, the deepest of which may date back more than 20,000 years. That date would make Gunung Padang older, by a significant margin, than any other known monumental structure on the planet. Older than Göbekli Tepe, older than the last ice age. The finding has been fiercely disputed by many archaeologists, and the full results are still being evaluated. But the site exists. The layered construction exists. The unresolved question is simply how old it really is. And if the earliest phase does indeed predate the Younger Dryas, the implications for the timeline of civilization are severe. On the small island of Malta, in the center of the Mediterranean, another set of megalithic structures has been quietly causing problems for the conventional chronology for more than a century. The Maltese temples, including the complexes of Gantija, Ahed, Arkem, and the Nadra, are built of massive limestone blocks fitted together with a precision that is difficult to reconcile with the small, apparently simple population of the island at the time of their construction. Gantija, on the sister island of Gozo, was built around 36.5 BC. That is earlier than the oldest Egyptian pyramid. The Mayan Dija translates as place of the giants, reflecting the local tradition that such stones could only have been moved by beings. Alongside the temples, Malta preserves a network of underground cart ruts carved into solid limestone that seem to track toward cliffs and vanish over their edges. Their purpose, their age, and their builders all remain debated. Some researchers have suggested that they predate the temples themselves. Others have proposed that they are the remnant of a transportation system that served a population larger and perhaps older than the agricultural communities that Malta is currently believed to have supported. In the precision workshops of ancient Egypt, there is yet another category of evidence that deserves attention. The pre-dynastic and early dynastic stone vessels of Egypt, many of them dating to before the 3rd millennium BC, have long been a source of quiet wonder among those who have examined them closely. They are carved from some of the hardest stone on Earth: granite, diorite, schist. Their interior chambers are hollowed out with a precision that is difficult to achieve, even with modern tools. Long-necked vessels whose narrow throats lead to spherical inner cavities, perfectly smoothed, with walls of uniform thickness. Some have been examined using modern metrology equipment and found to exhibit tolerances that, according to the engineers who studied them, require a machining capability that the ancient Egyptians are not known to have possessed. The vessels are real. They sit in museum cases around the world. The question of how they were made, and by whom, has never been satisfactorily answered. And the majority of them, it should be noted, come from stratigraphic contexts that are early. They were already old when the pyramids were being built. They were inherited by the dynasty that built the pyramids, from the dynasties that came before. These sites, and others like them, do not collectively prove any single theory. They do not, in themselves, establish the existence of a pre-flood civilization. But they do something more subtle. They establish that the record we have is more complicated than the textbook timeline suggests. that there are discoveries that do not fit neatly into the accepted story, that the gap between Göbekli Tepe and Sumer is not as empty as we once thought, and that when the Sumerians wrote of a world before their own world, they may have been describing something that, in however fragmentary a form, was real. Beyond the physical sites, there is also the question of knowledge itself. Certain kinds of knowledge preserved in the ancient texts seem to require an observational history that the cultures preserving them cannot plausibly have possessed. The precession of the equinoxes is the clearest example. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which causes the apparent position of the stars to shift relative to the solstice and equinox points, is a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. Detecting it requires accurate astronomical records kept over many generations. It is conventionally said to have been discovered by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC. But the mythological traditions of the ancient world appear to encode precessional cycles in their imagery. The cosmic ages of Hindu cosmology. The zodiacal ages implied in certain Mesopotamian and Egyptian iconography. These encodings, if they are intentional, would imply astronomical observations going back tens of thousands of years, which would imply a continuity of knowledge that mainstream history has no place to put. The researchers who compiled these observations, most notably Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend, in their mid-20th century study of ancient mythology, drew a provocative conclusion. They suggested that a significant portion of world mythology is actually a technical language, developed by a prehistoric science of skywatching, and passed down in the form of stories long after its original meaning had been forgotten. The gods of ancient myth in this reading are not primarily personified forces of nature. They are constellations. Their movements are the movements of the heavens. The mythologies of the ancient world, taken together, form a kind of coded astronomical library, carried across millennia, transmitted by people who no longer knew what they were transmitting. If this is true, then the Anunnaki, the ones who came down, may not have descended from Nibiru. They may have descended from an older astronomy, an astronomy that required thousands of years of observation to construct, an astronomy that could only have been assembled by a civilization with the patience, the organization, and the continuity to watch the heavens across the span of several precessional cycles. And such a civilization, in the mainstream timeline, is not supposed to have existed before Sumer. The dovey wet of what Tivaniefren gotten. There is a sobering thought that comes out of all of this, once the fragments are laid next to each other. It is the thought that memory, at the scale of civilizations, is fragile, that the story of humanity is not a single continuous narrative, kept in a single safe archive, but a series of broken fragments, carried unevenly by cultures that rise and fall, transmitted imperfectly from generation to generation, shaped and reshaped by the priorities of those who do the transmitting. We do not remember all of what we once knew. We do not remember most of it. And the parts we remember, we often remember in a form that has drifted so far from the original that we no longer recognize it as memory at all. Think about the scope of the time we are discussing. 12,000 years. That is not a small stretch of time. It is roughly 4 times the length of all recorded history. It is more than twice the distance between now and the building of the Great Pyramid. In 12,000 years, empires rise and fall. Languages are born, mature, and die. Technologies are invented, dominant, and forgotten. The Roman Empire lasted, in its various forms, for about 2,000 years, and when it fell, the knowledge it had accumulated did not simply pass gently to its successors. Libraries were lost. Techniques were forgotten. The skill of making certain kinds of concrete, which the Romans used routinely to build structures that still stand today, was lost for more than 1,000 years, and only recently recovered. And that was just 2,000 years ago. Compound that kind of forgetting across 12,000 years, and the weight of what could have been lost becomes staggering. What we call prehistory is not really prehistory in the sense of a time without history. It is a time whose history was not preserved in a form we can read. The people who lived in those millennia had lives. They had loves. They had tragedies. They watched their children grow up. They buried their dead. They told stories around their fires. They built things, and the things they built were mostly made of wood, of reed, of earth, of materials that do not survive the centuries. Only the stones remain. And even the stones, most of them, have been worn down by time and weather into unrecognizable shapes. We see the past through the narrow window of what survived. And what survived is a tiny, tiny fraction of what was. This is the reason the anomalies matter. Not because they prove any specific theory, but because they are the pieces that refuse to dissolve. The pieces that were built from materials so durable, or placed in conditions so protective, that 12,000 years of weather and disaster and human reuse did not destroy them. They are our only real connection to the deep past. And when they do not fit the story we have been told, we have to take that seriously. We cannot wave them away. Because for every Göbekli Tepe that has been discovered, there may be 100 sites, 1,000 sites, 10,000 sites that never will be. Because their materials did not last, because the sea swallowed them, because the desert covered them, because the rainforest grew over them, because the people who came after dismantled them and used their stones for other purposes. There is a concept in philosophy of history sometimes called deep time humility. It is the recognition that the span of human existence on this planet is not what we casually imagine it to be. Homo sapiens, by the current fossil evidence, has been anatomically modern for at least 300,000 years. That is a long time. It is long enough for civilizations to have risen and fallen many times over, without leaving any trace that we could recognize. Most of that 300,000 years is genuinely lost to us. We have no records from it. We have no buildings from it. We have only scattered tools, a few bones, some charred hearth remains. The rest is silence. And we assume, because we have no evidence to the contrary, that for most of that time our ancestors did nothing remarkable. That they lived in simple, small groups, that they did not build, that they did not write, that they did not dream anything that would have surprised us. That may be true. It is the parsimonious assumption. It is the one that follows from the evidence we currently have. But the absence of evidence is not, in itself, evidence of evidence. And every time a new site is discovered that pushes back the known limits of what our ancestors were capable of, the parsimonious assumption becomes a little less certain. Göbekli Tepe pushed back the dating of monumental architecture by thousands of years. What the next discovery will push back is not yet known. There may be other Göbekli Tepes, still buried, still waiting. There almost certainly are. What they will teach us when they are found is not predictable. It may not match the story we have. The human impulse to see ourselves as the endpoint of progress is a strong one. Every generation tends to assume that what it knows is the peak of what has ever been known. That the technology of its own age is the most advanced technology ever produced. That the philosophy of its own age is the most sophisticated philosophy ever articulated. That the science of its own age is the most accurate science ever attempted. Some of this may be true. For some categories of knowledge, there is genuine cumulative progress, and a physicist of the present knows things that no physicist of the past could have known. But for other categories of knowledge, the picture is less clean. Philosophical insight is not a cumulative science. Craftsmanship, in many traditional domains, has declined rather than improved over the centuries, as older techniques have been forgotten, and newer techniques have replaced them without preserving all of what was lost. The skill of traditional timber framing, of pre-industrial glassmaking, of Damascus steel, of certain forms of ink production, have all been lost at various times and only partially recovered. We are not as unlike our ancestors as we like to imagine. And in some ways, we know less than they did. If this is true at the scale of centuries, it is almost certainly true at the scale of millennia. The people who lived in the world that ended with the Younger Dryas, whoever they were, would have had their own skills, their own traditions, their own accreditions, their own accumulated understanding of their world. Some of that understanding may have been carried forward, in fragments, by the survivors. Some of it may have been lost entirely. The people of Sumer, 5,000 years ago, were already separated from the world they remembered in their tablets by a gap of thousands of years. They were telling the story of an inheritance they had only partially received. By the time their version of the story reached the later civilizations that inherited it in turn, the distortion would have compounded. We are, ourselves, at the end of a long chain of such distortions. And the story we are now hearing about the Anunnaki and the flood and the age before our age is not the story as it was originally told. It is the story as it has reached us through thousands of years of retelling what the original story was, and whether it bore a closer resemblance to actual events we may never fully know. And if, when that story is finally told in full, it turns out that the Sumerians were telling the truth about their teachers, the truth will not have been hiding. It will have been there all along, in the tablets, in the king lists, in the temple traditions, in the flood stories that every ancient culture preserved. We just were not ready to hear it. A sip of closing reflection. Here is where we have to stop and sit with what we have seen. Not because there is nothing more to say. There is always more to say when it comes to the lost parts of the human story. But because the honest answer to the central question of this episode is that we do not know. We do not know with certainty what came before the Sumerians. We do not know who built the first stones at Göbekli Tepe and then buried them. We do not know whose memory survived the ending of the Younger Dryas and carried the first seeds of civilization into the warming world that followed. We do not know what the Anunnaki were, and we probably will not know in any full sense within our lifetimes. What we do know is this: the Sumerians believed someone came before them. The Egyptians believed someone came before them. The Hebrews, the Greeks, the peoples of India and China and Mesoamerica all carried versions of the same memory. A time before our time. A world before our world. Ended by water. Remembered as golden, taught to us, before it vanished, by beings whose origin we no longer understand. That memory is not evidence in the strict sense. It is not a fossil or a carbon date or a geological sample. But it is consistent. It is ancient. It is older in its written form than the oldest known civilization, and it refuses to go away no matter how many times it is dismissed. Maybe the memory is wrong. Maybe it is the natural residue of an imagination that keeps inventing the same story out of the same raw material. Maybe flood stories are just the product of people living near rivers, and divine teachers are just the product of people needing to justify their kings. Maybe the 12,000 years of silence are not a mystery, but a normal archaeological gap, and the Sumerian king list is not a record but a poem. These are possibilities. They may even be the correct possibilities. The honest scholar holds them open, but it is also possible that the memory is not wrong. That something did happen. That a civilization did exist in the Ice Age world, and that it was lost, and that its survivors were remembered for a while by the people they taught, and that slowly, across the thousands of years that followed, the memory of what those survivors actually were dissolved into something else, into myth, into theology, into the figures that the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, and that the Egyptians called the gods of Zep-Tepi, and that the Hebrews called the sons of God. And that the only way we will ever know for sure which of those possibilities is the true one is to keep digging. To keep translating, to keep asking the ground what it remembers. And maybe you are watching this right now from a place that once was part of that world. Most of us are. If the lost civilization hypothesis is even half right, the coastlines of the Ice Age are underneath us. The settlements of the Ice Age are underneath us. The stones of the Ice Age, if they still exist, are underneath us. We are not separate from that forgotten time. We are standing on top of it. And somewhere down there beneath our feet, the first chapter of the human story may still be waiting to be read. Here is the thought that we will leave you with. It is not an answer. It is not a conclusion. It is the thing that comes to a person when they have sat long enough with the quiet of the deep past. The things we have built, the things we are proud of, the things that make this century feel unprecedented, will not last forever. The future is not going to remember us the way we remember ourselves. And the people who come after us thousands of years from now, if any come at all, may know very little of what we did. They may find one of our buildings, preserved by some accident of geology, and wonder who made it. They may find fragments of our writing and struggle to translate them. They may tell each other stories, at their own fires, about a lost age when people could speak across the world in an instant, when they had built machines that could fly, when they had reached the moon. Those stories, in their time, will sound like myth. They will be waved away by the serious scholars of that distant future. And the truth of what we were will hang, just out of reach, In the gap between what is remembered and what is proven, perhaps the greatest mystery is not what ancient civilizations knew. Perhaps it is how much of that knowledge humanity may have forgotten. And perhaps the deepest question is not whether there was a world before this one. Perhaps it is whether in 12,000 years anyone will remember ours. Chuh.